Welcome, dear listener, to Candlelight Mysteries, where every whisper hides a truth and every shadow conceals a secret. Tonight, as the wind sighs against the glass and the flame trembles low, we invite you into another tale of suspense and candlelight. Let the mystery begin. The candlelight beginning. The evening mist curled like a shroud over the village of St. Mary Mead. The last of the daylight dwindled beyond the hedgerows, leaving the cottages bathed in soft amber from their windows. A faint drizzle tapped against the panes of the Bluebell Inn, where a single table had been set, gleaming silver, fine china, and a candle trembling in its brass cradle. The occasion was peculiar, a private dinner by invitation only. No name had been signed upon the cards, yet every recipient felt compelled to attend. The handwriting was elegant, assured. For a night of gratitude and remembrance. Bluebell Inn, 8 o'clock sharp. At precisely 8, the guests began to arrive. Mrs. Constance Weatherby entered first, her pearl earrings quivering as she shook the damp from her shawl. Behind her came Mr. Giles Fortescue, the retired banker whose stern jaw and polished cufflinks betrayed an appetite for control. Then the Reverend Henry Cole, mild of manner, smelling faintly of pipe tobacco and sanctity. And finally, the newcomer to the village, Miss Evelyn March, slender, pale, with eyes like winter glass. 4 of us, murmured Mrs. Weatherby, glancing at the table. And a 5th chair. How curious. Indeed, the table was set for 5. The 5th plate gleamed under the candlelight, its napkin folded like a swan. No one spoke of it, but each felt its presence, an unspoken guest, unseen yet expected. The hostess, Mrs. Ellery, proprietress of the Bluebell Inn, moved quietly between them, her face unreadable. "If you'll be seated," she said softly. "Dinner shall be served." The soup arrived, leek and potato, garnished with thyme. They ate in uneasy silence, broken only by the faint creak of the old clock on the wall. Then came the roast, pheasant glazed with red currant, potatoes crisped to perfection. But as the clock struck 9, the door to the dining room opened with a slow, deliberate groan. Every head turned, a shadow entered, tall, indistinct, cloaked in rain. The candle flickered violently as the figure paused at the 5th chair. The guests stared, breath suspended. "Good evening," said the stranger, voice low and unfamiliar. "I believe I am expected." He took his seat without another word. Mrs. Weatherby's spoon clinked against her plate. "And who might you be, sir?" The stranger smiled faintly. "A friend of the deceased?" "The deceased," stammered Reverend Cole. The stranger looked around the table. "Surely you all received the same invitation?" "A night of gratitude and remembrance. Was it not signed? In memory of Harold Langton?" A silence, deep as the grave, fell upon the table. For Harold Langton, once the most charming man in the village, had been dead these 5 years. His death had been sudden, whispered about, and conveniently forgotten. The stranger raised his glass, the candlelight glinting across the rim. "To the truth," he said softly. Outside, thunder rolled over the hills. Inside, the 5th chair sat no longer empty, and somewhere in the Bluebell Inn, a window creaked open, letting in the cold breath of something long buried. Chapter. The morning after the dinner at the Bluebell Inn broke cold and brittle, like glass underfoot. A thin frost clung to the hedges, and the fog that hovered over St. Mary Mead made every shape, every tree, every chimney seemed to whisper of secrets. At 7:30, the village postmistress, Mrs. Larkin, noticed something strange. The curtains of the inn's dining room were still drawn, the fire unlit, though Mrs. Ellery was known for rising early. Concerned, she crossed the lane, her boots crunching the gravel, and knocked at the door. No answer. She knocked again. Still silence, save for the faint rattle of a window upstairs. When she finally pushed open the door, it groaned on its hinges like an old warning. Inside, the air was heavy, stale, scented faintly with candle wax and cold meat. The remnants of last night's dinner lay undisturbed, plates half cleared, wine glasses smudged, and a single candle burned down to the base. Wax pooled like tears on the cloth, and at the head of the table, in the chair where the stranger had sat, slumped a body. The man's face was pale, lips tinged blue, eyes open as if frozen mid-surprise. The napkin, still neatly folded on his lap, bore a dark stain spreading slowly, a stain of deep, dreadful crimson. Mrs. Larkin dropped her basket with a cry that shattered the silence. Within the hour, the village square was alive with whispers. "A murder at the Bluebell Inn!" That dreadful dinner. They say the dead man came from nowhere. And so it was that word reached Miss Jane Marple. She was at her sitting-room window when the young constable, Fred Renshaw, came rushing up the path, hat in hand, cheeks flushed from the cold. "Miss Marple?" "Ma'am, dreadful business at the inn." Mrs. Ellery's beside herself. "Seems a man's been found dead. Poisoned, maybe." Miss Marple turned from her knitting, her eyes keen and mild. "Poisoned, you say? Oh dear, I was afraid that dinner would end in unpleasantness." "You knew about it, ma'am." "I was invited," she said, setting her knitting aside. "But I declined." "A curious invitation, unsigned no less. Such things never end well, Constable. Would you perhaps come down, ma'am?" "The inspector's on his way, but—" "Well, Mrs. Ellery's near fainted." Miss Marple rose, fastening her cardigan. "Of course, dear. But do fetch my shawl, will you? I find mysteries are best met with a touch of warmth." The scene at the Bluebell Inn was one of subdued horror. The small dining room, usually bright and hospitable, seemed shrunken by tragedy. The inspector, a broad man named Armitage, was already there, pacing the floor with a notebook in hand. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, turning. "Trust you to appear at the scent of trouble." "I rarely need to appear," she replied serenely. "Trouble tends to call," he grunted. "Victim's a man, early 40s, unknown to the villagers. The guests say he called himself a friend of Harold Langton. Dead of some kind of poisoning, I'd wager. Lips show the usual signs. But what was in his glass, that's the trick." Miss Marple bent over the body. The expression was oddly peaceful, not terror, but curiosity frozen in death. "And the others?" "In the parlour. 4 of them. Nervous as hens in a storm." "I imagine they would be," Miss Marple murmured. "They've seen a ghost, and now death itself." She straightened, smoothing her skirt. "May I speak with them?" The parlour smelled faintly of lavender and anxiety. Mrs. Weatherby was dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Reverend Cole stood by the window, mumbling something about the Lord's will. Mr. Fortescue sat rigid, tapping his cane against the floor, and Miss Evelyn March stared into the fire, motionless. Miss Marple's gentle voice seemed to calm the air. "I'm so sorry you all had such a dreadful night. Might you tell me what occurred, in your own words?" Mrs. Weatherby began, her voice trembling. "We arrived at 8, just as the letter said. The dinner was pleasant enough, though none of us knew who sent the invitations. Then at 9 the stranger arrived. Said he was a friend of Harold Langton. Dear Harold, gone so young. We were astonished, of course, but, well, one can't be rude, can one?" Miss Marple nodded. "And what was his manner?" "Polite," said the Reverend. "A little strange, perhaps. He asked questions about the past, about Harold. Seemed to know quite a bit about us all, actually." Miss Evelyn March spoke softly then, without looking up. "He said he came to remember Harold, to right an old wrong. Did anyone touch his glass or plate after he arrived?" Miss Marple asked. Mr. Fortescue's jaw tightened. He poured his own wine. Said he preferred to serve himself. Drank half a glass, then stopped talking. Just like that. Clutched at his throat and— He broke off, shuddering. "And you all sat there," Miss Marple said quietly. "Watching him die." Mrs. Weatherby let out a sob. "It was over so quickly. I thought he'd choked." Miss Marple's eyes moved to the fire. A dreadful thought, to die among strangers while speaking of remembrance. "Tell me, did anyone here truly remember Harold Langton?" Silence. Then Reverend Cole cleared his throat. "We all knew him, of course, though, I confess, not intimately. He was a charming young man, but, well, his end was most unfortunate." Miss Marple turned toward him. "Unfortunate? Or convenient?" He blinked, startled. "I beg your pardon?" But she did not answer. She was gazing at the 5th glass still standing on the mantelpiece, the glass the constable had placed aside for evidence. The rim caught the morning light like a halo of gilt. "Inspector," she said at last, "I think we should have that glass tested for cyanide. And perhaps, too, look into who exactly had reason to remember Harold Langton, and who would rather he stayed forgotten." Outside, the church bell tolled 8. The mist had not yet lifted from the village, and neither, it seemed, had the shadow of the past. Chapter 3. Inspector Armitage set the 5th glass down with the care of a priest handling a relic and tugged his moustache in thought. "Right then. No one leaves the inn until we've taken statements. And no one touches the decanters. Miss Marple, who had been quietly inspecting the silver cruet as though it might whisper, turned her attention to the table. The dinner service had been laid with a crisp exactness, knife and fork aligned, napkins folded into pale swans that now sagged like the fallen. The dead man's place was the neatest of all, save for the dark bloom on the napkin and the glass that had glittered like a chalice in his hand. "Mrs. Ellery," Miss Marple said sweetly to the hostess, "were there 2 decanters last night, or only 1? The proprietress, harried and ashen, clasped her keys in both hands. "2, miss. The older one from the inn cellar, claret from last season, and a newer one that Mr. Fortescue sent along earlier in the afternoon. Said it was a gift to mark a night of remembrance. He left it with a note. For the table. The better vintage deserves the better decanter." It was very kind. Miss Marple's eyes flickered to Mr. Fortescue, whose cane now clicked against the hearth tiles with an involuntary rhythm. "How thoughtful," she murmured. "And very practical too." "Nothing so pleases the palate as a handsome vessel," Fortescue gave a curt nod. "I saw no harm in making an evening of it. The invitation was unusual, but in matters of hospitality one may do worse than offer good wine." "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "One may—" Armitage cleared his throat. "We'll start with the order of service, Mrs. Ellery. Soup, then roast, then—" "Pudding, treacle tart. Coffee after." Her voice trembled. "We never reached the coffee." He turned to the parlour, where the 4 dinner guests had reassembled like weary actors between acts. "We'll have each of you in the private sitting-room one by one. May I remain?" Miss Marple asked mildly. Armitage gave her a long look, the kind that said he'd rather not but knew better. "So long as you don't interrupt." "My dear Inspector," she said, smiling, "I rarely need to." Mr. Giles Fortescue sat with the air of a man who has paid for the chair on which he sits. He placed his cane across his knees, quite straight, and met the inspector's eye without blinking. "You arranged a decanter," Armitage began. "Why?" Fortescue shrugged. "I thought the evening merited decency. Harold Langton was, whatever else, decorous. If one marks his memory, one does not do it with inferior glass. Did you know Mr. Langton well?" Miss Marple asked, her tone as light as meringue. "Well enough. He came to me once or twice for advice. Frivolous young man. Charming but unsteady. There was some talk of a small loan. He was eager for a business venture. A motor car hire concern, I think. I advised against it." "Advised," Miss Marple said. "Or refused?" The banker's jaw set. "Both amount to the same. Yet you bring a gift for his remembrance," Armitage said. "Conscience, Mr. Fortescue?" "Tradition," Fortescue replied crisply. "Respectability. The village does not prosper by dancing on its own graves." "Tell us about the stranger," Miss Marple suggested. Fortescue's eyes cooled. He entered like an actor too late for his cue, took the 5th place as though it had been warmed for him. He had the air of a man testing a room for drafts. Subtle, but there. I noticed his cuffs, neatly laundered, but the stitching was country work, not town. And his shoes had been polished recently, over older scuffs. "That is not guilt," he added, glancing at Armitage. "It is economy. Economy can conceal guilt," the inspector said. "And guilt can be very economical indeed. Who poured his wine?" Miss Marple asked. "He did," Fortescue replied. "From the newer decanter, the one I had sent." He made a little speech. "To the truth." Then he drank. He smiled. And then, the blue about the lips, the clutch at the throat. "Cyanosis, if memory serves. I was in the Territorial during the war." Miss Marple's hands lay quiet in her lap. Cyanosis, she thought. An ugly word for an ugly shade. But cyanide is choosy, a bitter almond mercy that not all noses detect. "Aloud," she said. "And after?" We, all of us, froze. The Reverend prayed. Mrs. Weatherby cried. Miss March stood up and said, "No." That was all. Simply no, as if she were refusing a dance. And then he was gone. "Did you touch the glass?" Armitage pressed. "I did not." "Nor the decanter?" "No." Miss Marple leaned in, her eyes bright as candle flames at vespers. "Mr. Fortescue, you said Harold came for advice and you advised against. Did he ever threaten to take his business elsewhere? Or to share certain correspondences that would make you appear unsteady?" The cane's tip struck tile. Click. "I do not answer innuendo." "Of course not," Miss Marple said sweetly. "It rarely answers back." Mrs. Constance Weatherby came in with her lace handkerchief fluttering like a distressed bird. She arranged herself in the chair as though it had teeth. "I shan't be long," she sighed. There is nothing to tell. There is always something, Mrs. Weatherby, Miss Marple murmured. Even when it is only what one would rather not tell. Constance dabbed at her eyes. He startled us. That is all. The invitation was, oh dear, there was a pressed bluebell inside mine. A sentimental gesture. Harold once sent such things. He had a taste for the picturesque. But 5 years. It's not done, haunting people with dried flowers. A bluebell, Armitage repeated. And no signature? No signature, she said. But the same elegant hand Harold used to admire. A night of gratitude and remembrance. That phrase, she shivered, as if gratitude could ever be forced. Miss Marple's voice was kind. Mrs. Weatherby, did Harold ever court your niece? Constance started. Who told you? Well, yes, briefly. Lila was taken with him, as girls are with shining things. But it did not end in an engagement. It ended in something else, Miss Marple asked gently. Constance's hand stilled. Lila cried for a week. Then she went to Brighton and came back with a little more sense and a little less innocence. Harold's charm, as with certain wines, does not improve on a second tasting. Did you hold it against him? Armitage asked. I held it against foolishness, she said primly, though her pearls quivered. And against men who say always and mean until Saturday. But Harold died. And grief forgives many things. The stranger mentioned gratitude, Miss Marple said. Gratitude implies a debt. Who owed what to Harold, or for Harold? Did you receive any benefit, monetary or otherwise, after his death? Certainly not, she cried. Then lower, there was some small legacy. He had been kind once, when my late husband was ill. A small note settled. The sort of thing one forgets to mention because it is not comfortable to remember. Comfort is a poor archivist, Miss Marple said. Constance Weatherby looked at the rug. I brought no poison to the Bluebell Inn, Miss Marple. Most women do not, Miss Marple replied, but some do not need to bring it. They send it ahead. Constance made a thin sound. You are very cruel. I am very old, Miss Marple said softly. And I have seen what gratitude costs. Reverend Henry Cole's face had the benign helplessness of a man who has watched too many birds fly into too many windows. He sat with hands folded, thumbs twining. You prayed, Armitage said. Before or after the man died? Before, the Reverend said, eyes lowered. A reflex, like reaching for a banister. I said, Dear Lord, we commend... And then he ceased to suffer. It was frightfully quick. Miss Marple smiled at him with grandmotherly approval. Reflexes can be very revealing, Mr. Cole. Did the stranger say anything? Confessional? Confessional. He considered. He asked us what we remembered about Harold. Then he asked what we had chosen to forget. He said remembrance without truth is only decoration. A sermon, Armitage muttered. Did you know Harold well? Not. Well, the Reverend's voice wavered. He came to me once, agitated, asked about forgiveness. The peculiar part is, he seemed determined to offer it rather than receive it. He said, if I forgive them, will that set me free? Them? Miss Marple repeated. He didn't say who, and then he died, Armitage said flatly. Soon after. The Reverend's eyes shone with a dull sorrow. A fall, they said. A low wall near Miller's Copse. A stumble by moonlight. How poetic and how inconvenient. Miss Marple's fingers paused in an invisible stitch. A fall by moonlight, was the moon full? I don't remember. Ah, she said, as if that were answer enough. And what of the stranger? Armitage pressed. He had calluses, the Reverend murmured unexpectedly. On the side of his index finger, here, he indicated. A writer, perhaps, or a man given to signing his name often. Miss Marple tilted her head. Not a violinist, then? Pardon? Nothing, she said. An old fancy. Miss Evelyn March did not sit at once. She stood for a moment in the doorway, as though listening to a tune at the edge of hearing, then took the chair and folded her hands over the little black reticule on her lap. Armitage observed her, polite but wary. Your full name for the record? Evelyn Harriet March. You're new to the village, he said. Why the invitation? Why you? Her lips lifted in the slightest of smiles. Perhaps because the past does not respect postcodes, Inspector. Miss Marple's eyes softened. My dear, were you perhaps acquainted with Harold Langton before you came to St. Mary Mead? Evelyn looked down at her hands. The skin is so honest around the knuckles, Miss Marple thought. It tells you all about doors opened and fists unclenched. At last Evelyn nodded. I knew him a long time ago, at a house in Hampshire where I worked as a companion to a difficult old aunt. He visited often. He was sometimes kind, only sometimes, Miss Marple asked. Evelyn's eyes were winter clear. Charm is not kindness, Miss Marple, though it can wear the same coat in bad light. Did Harold wrong you? Armitage asked abruptly. She flinched, then steadied. He wronged someone I loved. Who? Evelyn shook her head. Not my story to tell. Not yet. Armitage was about to press when Miss Marple's voice threaded softly between them. You said something last night when the stranger began to die. You said no. Why? Evelyn's mouth trembled. Because I recognized the expression. The surprise in it. It's the look of someone who expected to speak longer and found his sentence cut off. She swallowed. I have seen it before. In Hampshire? Miss Marple asked. In many places, Evelyn said. Where truth is only tolerated after dessert. You didn't touch his glass? Armitage asked. No. Nor the decanter? No. And you did not know his name? Evelyn's fingers tightened on the reticule. He did not give one. Only that he was a friend of Harold's. Forgive a small curiosity, Miss Marple said. Did you find the invitation?
Familiar?
For a heartbeat, Evelyn did not breathe. Yes. How so? The handwriting. She looked up, and there was a question in her gaze that had answers behind it. It resembled Harold's, only tidier, as if someone had practiced being him and then improved. While Armitage arranged for the constable to cycle to Much Benham for a telegraph to the county laboratory, glass to be tested for prussic acid. Send Mr. Davy if available. Miss Marple slipped into the corridor that led to the kitchen. She moved with the modest tread of a woman accustomed to finding lost sock buttons and misplaced motives. In the kitchen, the innkeeper's daughter, Molly Ellery, stood by the scullery sink, sleeves rolled, fear pinking her cheeks. You're Molly, Miss Marple said kindly. I came for a cup of tea, the sort that pours comfort rather than heat. Molly busied herself with the kettle. It's a wretched business, miss. The worst sort, because it insists upon being settled. Miss Marple looked at the row of bottles on a shelf. Vanilla essence, lemon barley water, a small brown apothecary vial labelled amyl nitrite in a faded hand. Medical, perhaps from old stock. Harmless in itself. She noted the unemptied coffee pot, the untouched cup and saucer set aside with a saucer's whisper of sugar. You served the courses, my dear? Yes, miss. Did anyone go to the sideboard where the newer decanter stood, before the stranger arrived? Molly frowned. No one touched it. They drank from the older claret with the soup. The new one was waiting, Mrs. Ellery said, for the proper moment. She likes a little theatre. And after the stranger arrived? He went straight to it, miss, as if he knew. How did he take his wine? Neat, miss, Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Some take it with soda, dear, Molly blushed. Not at table? No, Miss Marple agreed. Not at table, Miss... Molly hesitated. Do you think I shall be blamed? For what? For not knowing what was in a glass I didn't fill. Her voice dropped. I saw something, though. When he lifted his glass to drink, I saw a mark on his wrist. A pale band, like where a watch should be, but had been taken off. It struck me because I always notice such things, line marks. I've a habit of sewing to measurements. A habit, Miss Marple said, is always telling the truth about a person. You did very well to notice. And Miss... Molly swallowed. He smelled faintly, of almonds. But only after. Miss Marple nodded and patted the girl's hand. Go and sit for a little. Steam never stays in the kettle that shakes. By noon, the mist had lifted into a thin sky the colour of damp linen. The inspector, satisfied that the body could be taken under guard to the surgery, asked Mrs. Ellery for the invitations. She produced them from a drawer. 4 envelopes, identical cream stock, seals pressed not with wax but with a dab of gum, and a paper bluebell on each flap. The postmark was Much Benham, the next village over. Miss Marple laid them out on the dining table, where the wax tears had hardened. The hand is steady, she said. Elegant, as Mrs. Weatherby observed. But look, see this curious R in remembrance, a loop backward, an old-fashioned schoolroom flourish. And the M in Mead pointed continental. The sort one sees when ladies have learned from a French instructress. Armitage squinted. It's a hand, and it posted from Much Benham. We'll ask at the sub-office who bought cream stock. Do, Miss Marple said. And also ask at the stationer's who purchased a pad with light green fibres. See, under the light? It is watermarked with the faintest of fern veins. Not common here. You've a talent for paper, Armitage grunted. I have a talent, Miss Marple said gently, for the things ladies leave in bureau drawers. She lifted one envelope to her nose. And a faint scent. Orris root, I think. Not a modern perfume. And there is the faintest smudge of indigo, ink used to touch up a scuff. Someone corrected something on themselves before they corrected it on paper. Armitage stared. Do you mean shoe polish? Possibly. Or hair? Hair? Men have been known, Miss Marple said dryly, to improve themselves by artificial means. Dye, Armitage muttered. So our stranger may not be the colour he pretends. Few people are, Miss Marple said. By late afternoon, Miss Marple had returned to her ivy-curtained cottage. She set the little brass kettle to sing and lit a single candle, not for want of daylight, but because some thoughts require the society of a flame. She placed the 4 invitations beside her knitting and regarded them as one regards small, naughty children, patiently and with an expectation of confession. Poison, she thought, threading the needle of her mind. Cyanide is impatient. It acts quickly, too quickly to travel a long road from plate to veins. Therefore it must have waited near his lips. In the glass? Perhaps. In the wine? Perhaps. But then why only him? Unless only he drank from that decanter. And why would that be? Because he intended a moment. He chose the new decanter, as if he knew it had been set aside for ceremony. She remembered Molly's remark, a pale band where a watch had been removed. A man takes off a watch for 3 reasons: to wash, to mend a strap, or to pass through a moment without time in it, like stepping into a roll. He put on a self and took off a sign. Her tea steamed like a tame cloud. Miss Marple sipped it and consulted memory, that excellent old librarian with bun and pince-nez. A young man once visiting an aunt, charming, unsteady. A banker, firm with debtors but indulgent with his reputation. A reverend who had been asked about forgiveness. A widow with a niece bruised by love. And a newcomer whose eyes were shadows over ice. Evelyn March. Harold wronged someone she loved. Which means the wound is not dead. It is merely dressed. She set down her cup, extinguished the candle with pinched fingers, and smiled at the little twist of smoke spiralling upward. Yes, she said softly to the empty room. You'll do. Armitage sent for the decanter maker. Not the man himself, of course, but his bill, conveniently preserved in Mr. Fortescue's files at the bank and quickly procured by a young clerk eager to demonstrate utility. It confirmed that a cut-glass decanter with a silver collar had been purchased 2 weeks prior. The collar was engraved, GF in a discreet script. At the inn, Armitage examined the decanter anew. He unscrewed the silver collar to inspect the neck and held the stopper to the light. It was a common enough style, with a bulbous head and tapering ground glass that seated snugly. The inspector sniffed. No obvious bitterness. He moistened a scrap of paper with distilled water, touched it to the rim, then dipped it into a reagent that ought to blush for cyanide. Nothing. He scowled. Miss Marple, who had insisted on helpfully dusting the sideboard, found a tiny grit of something beneath the felt mat where the decanter had sat. She did not pounce on it. She drifted her finger over it as if soothing a fretful toddler, and only later, when no one watched, she looked. A mere crescent of crushed sugar, too small to sweeten even a mouse's tea. She thought of soda, of habit, of men who take their wine neat and men who do not. She thought of a sachet, a paper folded tight into a triangle, the sort one sees in cafes for those who like their coffee sweet. When she rejoined Armitage, she inquired almost idly, "Did anyone stir anything into the wine?" "No spoon marks." "No spoon," he said. "And who stirs wine with sugar, Miss Marple?" "This isn't a nursery." "No," she agreed. "But nurseries have a way of following one into adulthood. A person accustomed to pacifying bitterness with sweetness does not unlearn it because the menu changes." Armitage shrugged. "We'll see what Davy says about the glass when the lab reply comes back." "Do ask them to look for traces under the rim," Miss Marple said. "And inside the lip, not the bowl. If something were rubbed there, something crushed, that would greet the mouth first." Armitage made a note. "And, if you please," Miss Marple continued, "ask the constable to call at the chemist's. Not for prussic acid, our chemist would be cautiously honest about that, but for amyl nitrite. People confuse bottles. Some keep little phials to sniff for faintness. The smell masks other smells. And ask at the grocer's whether any bluebell seals, paper decorations, were sold with the cake frills. A lady would know these things. A gentleman might not." Armitage gave her a sidelong look. "You think a lady posted the invitations?" "I think the hand is a hand that has practiced looking like another hand," Miss Marple said. "That requires patience, a quality with which ladies, on the whole, are richly burdened." By evening, Amy the maid at the Bluebell Inn remembered something remarkable. The stranger's coat was damp only at the hem, miss, as if he had not walked far in the drizzle, only brushed a few puddles. "Those come from the cobbles just outside. So he came by motor, perhaps. Or he waited under the eaves until his cue." A driver at the garage recalled a hired motor idling a few yards off the square between 9:15 and 15:15, a small saloon, cream-coloured, with a driver who whistled "A Nightingale Sang in Berkeley Square." He saw a figure slip from the alley to the inn door at 9 precisely, but the stranger's pockets yielded no hire receipt, no licence, only a pocketbook with a slip of notepaper. "Bluebell Inn, 9 Mazuren, to the truth." The quotation marks were his own, as if he anticipated saying it. Meanwhile, the stationer in Much Benham remembered, selling cream envelopes with faint fern watermark to a gentleman with town gloves and country manners, who paid in cash and asked for the self-same shade of ink used by those who like to correct scuffs, a peculiar phrase the stationer would not have invented unaided. He sold the man a small bottle of indigo black. Mrs. Weatherby's cook swore that her mistress had sighed over a pressed bluebell on Tuesday and tossed it into the fire. Bad luck to keep the dead on paper. Yet Constance later produced a bluebell intact from her writing desk, a contradiction that made Armitage arch his brows. Constance confronted, fluttered. "Perhaps there were two," she said. There had not been two. Reverend Cole admitted, reluctantly, that Harold had once told him, in a voice raw with something like fear, "If I die before I forgive them, I shall follow them about forever with flowers." The Reverend had taken it for poetic hysteria, but one does not speak of following with flowers without intending a plan. Evelyn March, pressed for more, said quietly, "Harold and I once shared a joke about bluebells. He said they are the shyest bells. They ring only for the guilty." And she smiled then, and the smile was not one Miss Marple enjoyed. At 8:30 that night, under a sky that eavesdropped with stars, Inspector Armitage returned to Miss Marple's cottage with a scrap of paper and the look of a man who has found a penny when he needs a pound. "Davy wired," he announced. "Trace prussic acid on the inside lip of the glass. Barely enough for a fly to sneeze at, but enough to fell a man given the timing. No cyanide in the wine? Not in either decanter. Nothing in the stopper. The poison was placed where the lips would meet. Miss Marple accepted this as one accepts confirmation of a suspicion already worn in like comfortable shoes. And the glass was his alone. His alone, Armitage said. He chose it, he poured, he drank. He frowned at the invitations on her table. If the wine wasn't poisoned, someone must have doctored the glass before the stranger arrived. But then how did they know he'd sit there? They didn't, Miss Marple said. They arranged that he would. Armitage's eyes narrowed. Meaning? Meaning that when one sets a table for 5 with intention, one sets a little theatre. The 5th chair was at the head. The decanter for ceremony was placed closest to it. The glass with doom upon its lip was polished to shine and placed there as if it belonged to the man who would claim being master of ceremonies. And when he entered, he did what all such men do. He assumed the centre. Then the murderer had access beforehand, Armitage said, slowly. Mrs. Ellery, Molly, perhaps one of the guests who arrived early. Or someone who sent the invitations, Miss Marple added, and thus choreographed every step. Armitage set the telegram down and sighed. There's a nasty thought brewing, Miss Marple, that our stranger was not an avenger at all, but a sacrifice. And that begs the unanswered question, who would lure him here to die under Harold Langton's borrowed handwriting? Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the candle on her side table, unlit now, and to the way the room collected shadows at the corners, as if careful of them. She said nothing for a time. Then, very softly, the same sort of person who once needed Harold's charm for a purpose he did not understand, and later needed his silence. The sort of person who arranges gratitude like flowers in a vase and expects them to last forever. And who is that? Armitage asked. Miss Marple looked up, her eyes calm as a winter pond.
"Oh, Inspector."
"We shall see. But remember this, gratitude, when demanded, is merely debt in a clean collar." She rose, took up her shawl, and added, with a gentleness that always made men sit up straighter, "And debts in villages are paid in the coin that is nearest to hand." Outside, the wind lifted, and somewhere far away a hollow rang as if struck.
Chapter 3. The following morning broke sharp and bright.
Sunlight glancing off the frost like broken glass scattered across the lane. St. Mary Mead was quieter than usual. Gossip, having exhausted itself through the night, now held its breath. Yet within Miss Marple's cottage, thought moved swiftly, quiet as lace being woven, pattern by pattern, across a loom of memory. Inspector Armitage was already waiting when Miss Marple arrived. His hat was off, his hair damp with cold. "Morning, Miss Marple. You were right. Davy's test proves it. Cyanide on the glass lip, not in the wine. And the fingerprints? Smudged," he said. "Belong to the deceased and perhaps one other. Partial, feminine, no clear ridge." Miss Marple smiled thinly.
"Ah, yes. Murder, dear Inspector, is rarely tidy."
"It is like embroidery. The reverse always shows the chaos." She moved toward the table once more, her hand grazing the surface, as if reading it like Braille. "I wonder," she murmured, "what the stranger expected to find that night." He spoke of remembrance, of gratitude, of Harold Langton. Perhaps he did not come as an avenger, but as a messenger. Or a fool, Armitage muttered. If he didn't poison himself, someone meant him to die. The question is, who? The guests had been permitted to return home, but under caution. One by one, Miss Marple paid visits. A gentle, grandmotherly shadow with a mind sharp enough to cut through hypocrisy like silk. Her first call was upon Mrs. Weatherby. The widow received her amid an abundance of potpourri and nervous laughter.
"Oh, Miss Marple, my nerves are quite in tatters. I've scarcely slept."
"The image of that poor man, it won't leave me." "You poor dear," said Miss Marple kindly. "And yet, when one has kept so many memories, one must make room for a few new ones." Mrs. Weatherby blanched.
"Memories? Oh, yes, well, some are best forgotten." Miss Marple tilted her head.
"I understand Harold Langton once kept company with your niece." A pause. "A foolish affair. She was a silly girl, and did you ever suspect that her disappointment
"Had consequences."
Mrs. Weatherby's lips quivered.
"Consequences?"
"Perhaps," said Miss Marple softly, "a child?" The woman froze, eyes widening.
"No, no, never."
But the trembling of her pearls betrayed her. Miss Marple smiled gently. "Dear Mrs. Weatherby, I assure you I'm not scandal hunting.
"Only truth hunting."
You see, it helps one to understand why a man might wish to atone even after death." Mrs. Weatherby turned away, voice tight. "If Harold wronged Lila, he paid for it. Let the dead rest." "Miss Marple." "But," said Miss Marple almost to herself, "the dead rarely rest until the living do." Next she visited Reverend Cole, who stood in his vestry polishing candlesticks as though they might absolve him. "You once said Harold sought forgiveness," she reminded him. "Do you recall when that was?" The Reverend sighed. "A fortnight before he died. He was troubled, terribly. He said, 'If I confess, they'll be ruined. But if I keep silent, I shall be damned.' I told him that truth was divine and that secrecy is but sin in disguise." "And then he died," Miss Marple murmured. "Yes." "Did you ever wonder, Reverend, whether his death was divine retribution or human assistance?" He stared at her, paling.
"Surely you don't mean poison?"
Miss Marple's gaze was soft, pitying.
"Oh, no, my dear."
"I mean arrangement. One mustn't confuse providence with precision." He swallowed hard, and she left him there, polishing truth until it shone too brightly to bear. Her third visit was to Evelyn March. Miss March's little cottage lay on the edge of the wood, where the wind carried the sigh of old trees. Inside, a kettle whistled, and the scent of lavender hung in the air. "You have beautiful handwriting," Miss Marple said conversationally, admiring a letter half-written upon the desk. Evelyn looked up sharply. "I suppose I do. Why? Oh, no reason."
"Merely that it's rather similar to the invitations we all received. A fine hand, learned, perhaps, in a finishing school." Evelyn's smile was faint.
"Do you suspect me, Miss Marple?"
"I never suspect," said Miss Marple mildly.
"I observe. Suspecting is noisy. Observing is quiet."
"And you, my dear, are very quiet indeed." Evelyn returned to her tea, but her hand trembled slightly.
"If you must know, Harold Langton once promised to marry someone I loved. My sister, Alice. She was gentle, foolish. He ruined her, then left her with nothing but shame and a grave in the garden." "I am very sorry," said Miss Marple softly. "So am I," Evelyn replied, but not sorry enough to weep. Miss Marple studied her. "Then tell me, Miss March, did you write those invitations?" Evelyn met her gaze squarely. "If I had, I'd have signed my name." Miss Marple smiled. "Ah, but perhaps someone wanted it to look like you did." That afternoon, Inspector Armitage brought news. Post arrived from London. The coroner's report on the deceased. "You'll want to hear this, Miss Marple. The dead man's fingerprints matched those of one Harold Langton, taken 5 years ago during his motor accident in Hampshire." Miss Marple looked up sharply. "Harold Langton?" "The very same." "But Harold Langton was buried," she said. "Apparently someone else was buried as Harold Langton," said Armitage grimly. "The dental records confirm it. So the man who died last night was Harold himself." There was a long silence. Even the clock seemed to hold its breath. "So?" Miss Marple said softly.
"The ghost came to supper after all." "Which means," said Armitage,
"one of the people who knew him and believed him dead had a reason to make sure he truly was this time." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "And whoever forged those invitations knew Harold was coming back." That evening, Miss Marple sat once more by candlelight. Outside the sky wept drizzle, but within, her mind was bright and restless. She laid out the facts before her as if they were fragments of lace, delicate, intricate, waiting for their pattern to reveal itself. Harold Langton, alive, presumed dead for 5 years. Returns under guise of a stranger, invites those connected to his past, is poisoned from a glass. Prepared beforehand. The invitations resemble Evelyn March's. Handwriting, deliberately or deceitfully, all. 4 guests had cause to wish Harold gone. She thought of Mr. Fortescue's decanter, Mrs. Weatherby's hidden shame, Reverend Cole's uneasy piety, Evelyn March's buried grief, and in all of it, the faint scent of almonds and remembrance. "Remembrance," she whispered. "Gratitude, forgiveness, each word chosen carefully by someone who knew their weight." Her eyes fell upon the candle flame flickering over the rim of the glass holder. Its edge shimmered faintly, as if something invisible were there. "Of course," she breathed. The lip. She rose, pulled her shawl about her, and stepped into the rain. At the Bluebell Inn, Mrs. Ellery met her at the door.
"Miss Marple!"
"I didn't expect you back in this weather." "Truth," said Miss Marple serenely, "has very little regard for the weather." She moved to the sideboard, examining the decanter once more.
"Tell me, Mrs. Ellery, who polished the glasses that evening?"
"Molly did, miss, but only after I'd set them out." "And who set them out?"
"I did. And where did you keep them?"
"In the cupboard. Oh, but wait. One of them, the finest cut glass, was kept in the display cabinet. Mr. Fortescue insisted it be used for the guest of honour." Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed, and did you notice anything peculiar about it?" Mrs. Ellery frowned.
"Only that the rim was a bit cloudy."
"I polished it with vinegar." "Vinegar?" Miss Marple murmured. "How domestic."
"And yet it can also remove—"
"Traces," she smiled gently. Mrs. Ellery, you've been most helpful. Tell Molly to stay indoors this evening. It may not be safe to wander alone." The woman's eyes widened. "You mean the murderer's still about?" Miss Marple adjusted her hat. "My dear, the murderer has been about all along."
"And soon they'll be found out." The next morning,
Panic struck St. Mary Mead anew. Mrs. Constance Weatherby was found dead in her drawing-room, slumped beside the telephone, an empty teacup at her elbow. A faint smell of almonds lingered in the air. Inspector Armitage's face was grim as he surveyed the scene. "Suicide?" Miss Marple shook her head slowly.
"No, Inspector, silencing. You mean—"
She knew something, or someone feared she might remember too much. Armitage rubbed his temples. "So our murderer kills once by glass, once by cup. Efficient devil." "Not efficient," Miss Marple said softly.
"Desperate."
"You see, poison is not merely a tool."
"It is a confession, a declaration that one fears to face their victim's eyes. That night—"
Miss Marple requested that all remaining guests, Mr. Fortescue, Reverend Cole, and Miss March, gather once more at the Bluebell Inn, the same room, the same table, the same faint smell of wax and memory. "I ask your indulgence," she said, her voice calm but cutting through the silence like a bell through fog. "For I believe we now dine not with shadows but with truth." They stared at her, pale and uneasy. "Harold Langton," she began, "was not dead these 5 years. He fled under another name, perhaps from guilt, perhaps from fear. But recently he decided to return, to confess, perhaps to atone. He invited you all, directly or indirectly, to this table." "But," stammered the Reverend, "the invitations were not written by him," Miss Marple finished. "They were written as if by him, by someone who knew his hand intimately, someone who wanted you all gathered in one place, so that Harold Langton might die publicly and conclusively this time." Her gaze moved from face to face. "Mr. Fortescue," she said, "you provided the decanter and ensured the 5th glass, and the one with a cloudy rim, was set aside for the head of the table."
"You, more than anyone, orchestrated the seating." Fortescue's cane tapped once against the floor.
"You have no proof of that." "No," she said gently, "only logic. You once refused Harold a loan, but you also hid your own creative bookkeeping. He knew, didn't he?"
"He threatened to expose you." Fortescue's face hardened.
"You're an old busybody, perhaps," Miss Marple said, "but a busybody who can see where glass was ground with acid to mask the faintest trace of cyanide. A banker might understand the value of precision." Armitage leaned forward. "You're saying Fortescue killed him?" Miss Marple shook her head. "Not alone. Poisoners rarely work alone. They need persuasion, a motive." Her eyes turned to Evelyn March. "Miss March, your sister's death. That was the beginning of this tale, was it not? Harold ruined her, and Mr. Fortescue helped cover it up to preserve his bank's reputation. Harold's guilt was unbearable, but Fortescue's fear was worse. And when Harold threatened to return, to reveal the truth of both his sins and yours—"
Evelyn's breath hitched. "I did not kill him." "No," said Miss Marple softly.
"But you wrote the invitations, didn't you?" Evelyn's eyes filled. "Yes, he wrote to me, saying he wished to make amends."
"I thought if I brought them all together, truth would come out. I only wanted him to speak."
"I never meant for him to die." "And yet," said Miss Marple gently, "he did, because another guest came prepared for silence." Her eyes rested finally upon the Reverend Cole. The Reverend went white. "Good heavens, Miss Marple, surely you can't think—" "Oh, but I do," she said quietly. "You who preach forgiveness, who speak of redemption, you had Harold's confession locked in your desk these 5 years. You knew what he planned to reveal. And you feared the ruin of your own church when he spoke." Cole trembled.
"He was wicked."
"He was human," said Miss Marple. "But you, Reverend, you played God's way, and God does not use poison." He sank into his chair, face ashen. "He was going to destroy everything," he whispered. "And now," said Miss Marple, "you've destroyed yourself." Outside, The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke. Thunder rolled like the voice of judgment, and in that sound the truth felt almost merciful. Armitage rose. "Reverend Henry Cole, I'm arresting you for the murder of Harold Langton and Mrs. Constance Weatherby." Cole bowed his head, lips moving in silent prayer. Miss Marple, watching him, only sighed.
He prays now, but not for forgiveness or for understanding.
A much harder mercy to earn. Chapter 4. They gathered at twilight as the last carrion streaks of daylight drained from the sky and the village lamps popped into being one by one like cautious fireflies. The Bluebell Inn's dining room, scoured and reset, had the wary gleam of a theatre prepared for a second performance of a play that had ended in tragedy the night before. The brass candlesticks were polished within an inch of their lives. The silverware sat like soldiers at attention, and at the head of the table a fifth chair stood vacant, as though it had acquired a personality and a reputation. Inspector Armitage stood near the hearth, broad-shouldered and uncomfortably formal, like a man attending a christening that will turn at any instant into a funeral. He had brought the Reverend under guard and allowed him to sit, pale as chalk, with his hat in his hands. Mr. Giles Fortescue was already there, gloved and immaculate, the ivory head of his cane idle but ready. Evelyn March, in her dark wool, kept her face to the candle as though begging it to tell her what truth looks like. Molly Ellery hovered by the door with a tea-tray, determined not to fidget, not even when Miss Marple entered, small and mild and luminous with purpose. "Thank you for coming," Miss Marple said, as if she had invited them to a charity raffle in the church hall. "I thought it best that we finish our conversation at the very table where it began. Crimes are rather like embroidery.
One understands the pattern only when one sees where the threads were crossed." Armitage gave a dour nod.
"You asked for this, Miss Marple. I'm trusting you know where you're going." "I almost always do," she said pleasantly, and took her place not at the head but midway down, where a woman of sense in a village generally sits, able to see everyone at once and to be thought harmless by all of them. A fresh candle had been placed near her hand. She struck a match, cupped the flame, and lit it. Its small light swam upon the polish of the table and steadied there. "We shall speak quietly," Miss Marple said. "The truth has no need to raise its voice." "We begin," she said, "with a dead man who was already supposed to be dead. Harold Langton, 5 years buried and yet very much alive, returned to St. Mary Mead to shock the polite and agitate the guilty. He returned, I think, to confess. I imagine he meant to say something almost noble. I wronged you all in various ways. I intend to set it right." He chose a theatrical setting. She glanced at the fifth chair. "Because penance is rarely content to be private. It wants witnesses." Evelyn's clasped fingers whitened.
"He wrote to me," she whispered.
"Weeks ago. From London. Said he was weary of false names and false cities."
"He wanted to be Harold again." "Yes," Miss Marple said.
"And he asked you for addresses, which you gave. You wrote back. It is your neat, elegant hand we see echoed in the invitations. But you did not write those invitations." She looked at Fortescue. "Someone else did, someone who practiced the proportions of your loops and then put them to their own purpose." Fortescue's eyelids descended and rose with measured slowness. "You are conjecturing, Miss Marple?" "Observing," she corrected, smiling. "One does not need to be a handwriting expert if one has dusted enough bureau drawers. Miss March's M is narrow at the waist. The invitation's M is pinched at the feet."
"And there is a habit in the R, an old schoolroom flourish, that is absent from Miss March's letters." She turned to Evelyn.
"You learnt from a stern governess who disliked frippery. Whoever wrote those invitations learnt from a different hand."
"A hand that enjoyed its loops," Evelyn nodded, startled.
"My aunt's governess used to rap knuckles for such loops." "Quite," said Miss Marple. "What matters is not only who wrote, but who arranged. The fifth chair at the head, the better decanter placed closest to it, the cut-glass goblet drawn from the display cabinet and polished. Oh, so dutifully polished. She turned to Mrs. Ellery, who had slipped in and now stood as if arraigned. You said the rim was cloudy, so you used vinegar? Yes, miss. Mrs. Ellery wrung her hands.
It looked somehow
Dulled, because, Miss Marple said gently, someone had already rubbed the inside lip with a tiny folded paper that had been moistened with prussic acid, hydrocyanic acid.
If we wish to be fastidious, and then perhaps dusted the faintest sugar over it to mask a bitterness that I'm afraid not everyone tastes.
That was why a few undissolved crescents of sugar lay beneath the felt mat where the decanter had sat, one brushed away, one crushed beneath the glass's base when it was set down heavily. Not coffee sugar, Inspector, she added mildly, but the sorts of little triangles cafes have learned to package for those who want to sweeten a bitter mouth with a tidy gesture.
Our killer understands tidiness, Armitage's brows knotted.
Davy found cyanide on the lip only. Nothing in the wine? Precisely, Miss Marple said. The wine was merely the courier. The lip was the destination. She glanced at the Reverend. You prayed, Mr. Cole, and I do not doubt you are guilty of pride, and of the vanity that supposes one can preserve God's truth by interfering with it. You kept Harold's earlier confession under lock and key. That was a wrong. You were afraid. But you did not prepare the glass.
You are a man of small deceptions, not intricate ones. The Reverend closed his eyes as if a weight had been removed from his shoulders and replaced by another, more humiliating one. No, I did not. Miss Marple's voice softened.
You have other sins to answer for, sir, but not this. Evelyn's breath slithered out of her like silk.
Then who?
In villages, Miss Marple said, people pay what they owe in the coin that is nearest to hand. Harold owed a great many feelings, love and shame and atonement to a great many people. But one man owed money, and respectability, and his position. A banker's reputation is a delicate vase. One crack and everyone notices the flowers wilt faster. Mr. Fortescue did not blink. You persist, Miss Marple? Yes, she agreed kindly. Because you persist in being the only person who benefited from Harold's first death and his second. 5 years ago you refused him money and then discovered he had learned of what you call creative bookkeeping. There was a series of small shortfalls, a charity account temporarily borrowed against, a war widow's certificate misfiled with interest unpaid for a quarter, no grand embezzlement. Mr. Fortescue, merely small economies that allowed a man to live larger than his salary. Harold, being charming and careless, threatened to expose you when you refused him. An exposure would have forced a resignation and perhaps a charge. Then Harold fell, what a convenient verb, by moonlight at Miller's Copse and was buried under his own name, though not his own bones. Armitage shifted. You're saying Fortescue had a hand in that death? I'm saying, Miss Marple replied, that Harold's supposed death solved Fortescue's problem. But solutions age. They grow mouldy at the edges. When Harold wrote to Miss March and put foot back on English soil with a mind to confess, Mr. Fortescue read the signs too well. He set about arranging a second, more final funeral. Fortescue's nostrils flared the faintest sign of temper. You have no evidence, dear me, said Miss Marple. We have enough to begin to be satisfied. The decanter, purchased 2 weeks ago and engraved with your initials, was delivered by your boy to the inn with a mawkish note about better vintages and better vessels. Access to the display cabinet was obtained that afternoon. Mrs. Ellery keeps the key on a ring by the back door, where it hangs whenever she needs pastry. You dropped in to speak about the seating under the guise of gallantry. And later, in the very hour before dinner, a man whose shoes had been polished over old scuffs. Mr. Fortescue's valet has been on sick leave. I hear was seen by Amy the maid standing near the sideboard, fingers in his pocket. He left a crescent of sugar beneath the mat. Bankers, like ledgers, balanced to the farthing.
Murderers like edges tidy, Fortescue's mouth twitched. Idle gossip. An indigo, Miss Marple said serenely. Armitage looked up. Indigo?
The stationer in Much Benham sold indigo black to a gentleman who asked, in a flustered little way, for the shade used by those who like to correct scuffs. He also sold the cream stock with faint fern watermark. The same day, he sold blue paper petals to decorate cake boxes. Our invitations were sealed with paper bluebells, not wax, something a man unfamiliar with proper sealing might choose. When he was told in the post office that Miss March's hand looked familiar, he would have been excessively pleased with himself. Men are very proud of forgery when it looks like flattery. Mr. Fortescue admires Miss March's hand. He said so at dinner, did he not? Such a graceful hand, I believe, when he complimented the place cards. Mrs. Ellery? Mrs. Ellery blinked. He did remark upon the writing, miss. Said it was the prettiest clerk's hand he'd ever seen. Just so, said Miss Marple. And when the stranger arrived, Harold, in borrowed hair and a watcher's raincoat, he went straight to the head chair and lifted the very glass intended for him. He poured from the newer decanter, the ceremony decanter, and toasted truth. I dare say he never smelt the bitterness. Some people do not smell almonds at all. Shall I tell you, Mr. Fortescue, what betrays you more than paper or sugar or vinegar? The banker's voice was cool. Please do. Your arithmetic, Miss Marple said sweetly. You have counted everyone's risks but your own. A banker is trained to believe that other people cannot afford to draw attention to themselves. You calculated that Miss March, with an illegitimate nephew hidden in her family history and a dead sister in her shadow, would keep quiet. You counted upon Reverend Cole's cowardice and love of appearances. You counted upon Mrs. Weatherby's terror of scandal, and you were right about each in turn, but you did not count upon grief-changing denomination. When Mrs. Weatherby saw the stranger die and the invitations found to be forged, she telephoned the bank to ask for her old papers, the ones Harold had settled. She meant to confess it all to Inspector Armitage. You are very tidy, Mr. Fortescue. You tidied her, too, with a teacup. Evelyn's hand flew to her mouth. Armitage straightened.
The second death, Mrs. Weatherby, how could he?
By calling in the afternoon like a perfect gentleman, Miss Marple said, bringing a tin of the little sugared triangles from the pastry shop, a nice widow's indulgence, and showing concern. He's an old client after all. He made the tea while the maid answered the door. He crushed one tiny paper of cyanide and brushed it inside the favourite cup, then dusted a little sugar around the rim so the roughness would feel friendly to the lip. She turned to Fortescue. Your cane's head, ivory, was flecked yesterday with a faint crystalline blush.
I saw it in the afternoon light when you stood in the parlour.
Indigo hides black ink, but it does not love sugar. You rested the cane where the sugar bag had torn.
Even your cane recorded your thrift. Fortescue's composure cracked, not with panic, but with a small, hot disdain.
Tittle-tattle.
A smear of sugar. A shopkeeper's memory. Let's add a driver, Miss Marple said.
The hire at the garage. He recalls a cream saloon hired 2 nights running. The first to bring you back from Much Benham after posting the invitations. The second to idle near the square while you waited under the eaves of the inn to make your entrance just before 9, not as the stranger, of course, but for the pleasure of seeing if your theatrical prop would work. But you did not enter. You did not need to. Your work had already sat down at the head of the table and lifted his last glass. Fortescue's knuckles bleached on the cane. You think I waited in an alley to watch a man die? I think, Miss Marple said, you have the heart of a man who watches accounts mature. Whether the account bears money or blood is a matter of margin. Let us rewind our little play, Miss Marple said, and her voice dropped to a hush that made the candle lean closer. Molly, you came in with the roast and saw the man, Harold, lift the glass. You saw the pale band on his wrist where a watch had been. You thought it curious. That is because he had removed his old self, the watch he always wore, to wear a disguise. And you smelt, it was only then you smelt the almonds. You, Mr. Fortescue, flinched, though you hid it. For there is a moment every poisoner endures when the future comes sooner than expected. Reverend, you prayed. Your reflex is your alibi and your confession. Miss March, you said no, not because you had done anything, but because you saw a second chance forfeited before your very
eyes. Mrs. Weatherby,
God rest her, began to cry because she recognized responsibility finding its way
home. The room was so silent that the candle itself seemed to make a sound. Harold.
Langton chose the head of the table because the head of the table was offered to him, Miss Marple continued. He chose the ceremony decanter because ceremony is a siren to the remorseful. He chose the cut-glass goblet because it had been singled out for the guest of honour. All he did was follow a choreography
laid down for him by the man who needed him to drink from that very rim. Fortescue's
face had the sheen of marble now.
And what of motive?
You have invented one greedily. Where is your proof of any creative bookkeeping? Miss Marple's eyes warmed, strangely, sadly, in a small black ledger that a frightened junior clerk hid behind a pigeonhole at the bank 5 years ago. He is a cautious young man. He feared your displeasure then, but fears the gallows more now. He brought it this afternoon to Inspector Armitage. It shows advances taken and replaced, notes massaged across quarter ends. Nothing grand.
Nothing that would make a story in a London paper.
Only enough to make a country banker lose his chair. She inclined her head. You will forgive me. I promise myself very few prophecies. But I believe that ledger will be described in court as a pattern of conduct. The tidy phrase for a tidy man. Fortescue's cane tipped. The ivory head knocked once against the board. He had gone very still. His gaze slid finally to Evelyn March, and in it there was a bleakness unadorned by courtesy. You brought him back, he said. You and your letters and your righteousness. If he had stayed abroad, he would have stayed a coward, Evelyn said, her voice level. He came to speak because he found the conscience you lost. Fortescue turned to Reverend Cole. And you, your pious dithering, had you burned that paper, had you had the courage to do the wrong thing decisively? God preserve me from decisiveness in evil, the Reverend whispered hoarsely. Armitage moved then, not with relish, but with the grim resolve of a man who has been waiting for the puzzle's last piece to stop wobbling. He stepped to Fortescue's side and laid a heavy, workmanlike hand upon the banker's shoulder. Giles Fortescue, I am arresting you for the murders of Harold Langton and Constance Weatherby, and for conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. You need not say anything, though I've no doubt you'll try. The cane clattered to the floor. Fortescue did not struggle. He looked for a moment, as if he were listening to a sum being done in his head, and finally finding that there was no way to carry the one. You imagine yourself very clever, Miss Marple, he said softly. No, Miss Marple said, with a little sigh that was almost affectionate.
I imagine myself very old.
Old enough to have watched men who cannot bear to have their lives examined arrange instead for other people's deaths. But there is always some small grit, some sugar crystal, some paper petal, some tidying gesture that tells on them in the end. As Armitage signalled to the constable at the door, Fortescue stooped almost absently to retrieve his cane. It rolled from his gloved fingers and came to rest against the leg of the fifth chair. For an instant he stared at the chair, and his composure cracked into something like wonder. He looked like a clerk in bad hair, he said, and there was a boyish incredulity in the words. And still he terrified me. Conscience is a better wig-maker than any barber in Bond Street, Miss Marple replied gently. They led him away. The door shut. The candle guttered, then steadied. Silence fell, a silence different from the earlier ones, a silence with room in it. Reverend Cole sat, the colour slowly returning to his cheeks, and stared at his hands.
I taught forgiveness, he said, dazed.
And yet I feared it more than any soul in my parish. Evelyn sat very straight. What becomes of Harold now? He will be buried, Miss Marple said softly, under his own name. She looked at Evelyn, and her voice gentled further. He intended to speak that night, to ask forgiveness where forgiveness might not have been deserved, and yet might have been given in some lower coin. Acknowledgement, perhaps.
Reparation. She hesitated.
Your sister, Evelyn's eyes glistened. She is past earthly redress. After a moment. But there is a child, Miss Marple nodded. She had known it since Constance's pearls trembled in the parlour. There is a child. And there is a small account, a note, settled in Mrs. Weatherby's papers, showing provision. Inspector Armitage has seen it. It will not be enough, but perhaps Harold's poor relics will contain more. Dying men sometimes prepare envelopes. I think he meant to give you one at the end of the evening. He had the look of a man carrying a weight he intended to put down carefully. We shall look through his pocketbook.
Armitage produced it.
Within, folded with a deliberate neatness utterly unlike the carelessness attributed to Harold's youth, lay a letter addressed, in a hand steadier than he had any right to Miss Evelyn Harriet March. Evelyn accepted it with a sound that was not quite a sob and not quite a laugh. Read it at home, Miss Marple said. The walls there will know how to listen. Reverend Cole lifted his head. What am I to do? Resign? Miss Marple said, not unkindly. Then write to all the people you have comforted when you were not brave enough yourself, and tell them the truth, that you did not burn the paper that might have made their lives more honest sooner.
That you were afraid.
Some of them will be kinder than you deserve. That is the way of villages. But do not preach for a time. Listen. He nodded once, as if the collar had been loosened. Miss Marple rose. She pinched the candle's flame. Smoke corkscrewed up and vanished. We have finished, I think. Miss Marple, Evelyn said, standing with the letter clasped tight. How did you know? Truly? Miss Marple smiled, and in her smile was a very old, very particular sorrow that belongs to women who have watched many small wickednesses grow into larger ones. My dear, men who buy new decanters with engraved collars are always telling you what sort of crime they will commit. It will be ceremonial, fussy, and cowardly, done from the edge of the room with as little mess as possible. And men who have spent their lives not paying the price for their comforts develop an instinct for the moment when the bill is at last presented. Mr. Fortescue flinched when the toast was made. A woman notices such things. She turned to go. Inspector, I shall write down my observations for you. They are not proof, but you have proof enough.
And Molly, do put the tea tray down and sit.
Kettles do not sing themselves hoarse for nothing. They filed out of the room, one by one, leaving the fifth chair empty in the candle-scented dark, where it seemed, just for an instant, to watch them go and approve. Shall I continue to the epilogue? Poirot's journal, or Miss Marple's reflection? Miss Marple's reflection. The evening that followed was an old-fashioned sort of quiet, the sort that seems to arrive in slippers. Rain had washed the village clean and left the hedges trimmed in silver. At the cottage window, Miss Marple set aside her knitting, grey wool that had obstinately refused to become a cardigan, and opened her little notebook, the same one in which she recorded recipes for ginger biscuits and the Latin names of plants. On its first free page she wrote, "A case of gratitude and remembrance, a tale of sugar at the lip." She poured herself a small sherry and did what she always did at the end of such affairs. She made the stranger into a person she could pity without lying to herself about his sins. Harold Langton, charming, unsteady, and then, by some grace scarce understood, penitent. She had seen the look before, on a boy who returned a borrowed comb to the milliner after a dare, on a soldier who confessed to switching ration cards and wanted to set it right before he went up to London, on a widow who came to the vicarage to say she had been cruel to a friend once and could not sleep for the thought. It is not innocence that saves most of us, but a late, stubborn honesty. She sipped her sherry. The candle on the sideboard leaned into its own flame and held it. The room smelled of beeswax and someplace farther away, like a sea she'd never visited. People speak of poison as if it were a foreign country, she thought. but it is merely the home address of impatience. It is what one does when one cannot endure time doing its work upon our shames. Mr. Fortescue could not bear the long, public, humiliating unravelling of respectability. He preferred the neatness of a single evening. He forgot that neatness is a poor undertaker. It leaves a crease somewhere. She thought of Evelyn March, her upright carriage, the way she had said no when Harold began to die, the quiet ferocity with which she had taken the letter from Armitage's hand. Miss Marple had seen that too, the dignity of women who have outlived not only men but the opinions of men. In the morning she would have her to tea. She would ask, carefully, and without the vanity of offering advice, whether the child was provided for, whether Miss March might need help navigating the small, vicious bureaucracy of pity that attended such cases. A note to a certain lady in Bath came to mind, one who had made a discreet vocation of finding gentle situations for girls of good capacity and imperfect history. One does what one can, and one must never pretend it is enough. As for Reverend Cole, Miss Marple expected he would indeed resign, and then hover miserably about the village like a widower at his own wedding. She hoped, fervently, in her old way, that he would learn more from silence than he had ever learned from sermons. There are people, she had discovered, whose notion of morality is merely the wish to never be found out. And poor Mrs. Weatherby. Miss Marple closed her eyes and saw the pearls trembling, the little flutters of the handkerchief like a tamed bird's panic. Some people go to death still trying to hold a household together. She hoped very much that Constance would be buried with a bluebell tucked in the coffin, not because of Harold's mawkish sentiment, but because the flower, when pressed, keeps its colour and does not shout. That is how the dead deserve to be remembered, truthfully, and without noise. She trimmed the candle wick with small, neat scissors. The flame leaped and then settled. On her page she wrote what it cost them all. Then beneath it, line by line, Evelyn. The cost of a girlhood turned into guardianship. The cost of refusing despair. Its triumph, Reverend Cole. The cost of appearances adored too long. The cost of learning that fear is not prudence. Fortescue. The cost of money believed to be character. The cost at last of being counted. Harold. The cost of charm. The cost of late repentance. Too late for his own life, perhaps not too late for someone else's. She paused, pen in air. And what of me? That was not a question she allowed herself often. She was a woman who had loved and lost a long time ago, and who had learned that the village, for all its smallness, contains every sin and sacrament the world has invented, only reduced in proportion so one may study it without going blind. Her cost was merely sitting very still and listening until the story told on itself. On the mantel rested a bluebell, paper, one of the seals rescued from a bin at the inn. It looked absurdly pretty and extremely false. Miss Marple touched it, and then, with a decision both practical and ceremonial, dropped it into the fire. For a second it blackened and curled like a perverse fern. Then it was gone, and the log gave a small, indulgent sigh. "Gratitude and remembrance," she said aloud, tasting the words. "How beloved they are, and how they misbehave when we make them compulsory." She could hear the wind teasing the ivy at her window. She could hear beyond that a child laughing, someone's little boy trailing after a cat with a string. The world goes on, she thought, not without relief.
It always does.
And it often does not deserve to. She closed the notebook and smoothed her skirt, and allowed herself at last the smallest exhalation of weariness. The candle listened in that faithful way candles have, and she gave it her line, the one she always saved, until the room was ready to receive it. And as the candle burned low, another secret met its shadow. She sat there until the wick made a tiny clicking sound, and the last flame drew itself into a bead.
Admired its own reflection in the brass, and vanished. Shall I continue to the final outro section?
Candlelight Mysteries channel. Message. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Candlelight Mysteries, where every secret is revealed by the soft glow of candlelight. From village lanes to velvet-draped drawing rooms, we bring you elegant puzzles, quiet revelations, and truths that arrive on slippered feet. Another secret fades by candlelight.